In April 1942, after a brief retirement, the Vichy government was once again headed by naval. On April 16, 1942, on the eve of his return to power, the frontlines and partisans carried out one of the largest railroad sabotage attacks during the entire occupation of the country. It was organized at Meaux, 20 kilometers from Caen on the Paris-Cherbourg line. Jean Petituge, a former streetcar driver from Amiens, had been underground for several months, leading the frontlines and the partisans of Calvados. It was he who carried out this operation, about the results of which our illegal newspapers wrote 2 locomotives and 30 cars were put out of action, 300 German officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers were killed and wounded. The collaborationist press, subsidized by the occupiers, immediately began to gasp with indignation. Crétin wrote, in a country that has laid down its arms and given its word of honor not to fight, the conduct of sabotage by a non-combatant nation is an odious crime. He went on to call the resistance members agents of London, Moscow and Stalin and concluded, "The sabotage in Meaux is in no way accidental on the eve of Pierre Laval taking office as head of government." Another Caen's collaborationist newspaper was also not indifferent. It wrote, "There has been a terrible catastrophe, but there is no war here. How can it be so? Germany and France are not at war, but even in a war, the explosion of a train with troops not engaged in hostilities could not be considered a truly brilliant military feat." No doubt only the cells in which French and German Nazis tortured patriots were brilliant to these collaborators. Brilliant for them were also the punitive teams, the concentration camps, the robbed, humiliated, trampled France by the Nazi soldiers. The best answer to these traitors was found this time by Amiens streetcar driver Jean Petit. On the night of April 30, 1942, exactly 2 weeks after the first operation, the same train was derailed at the same hour and in the same place. About 100 Nazi soldiers, non-commissioned officers and officers were killed and wounded as a result. Among the many patriots to be commemorated, credit must be given to the valiant officers of the special organization who perfected the technique of sabotage on the railroads. These include Amiens tramman Jean Petit and Maurice Lemaire, and Amiens and Creuil railroaders Armand Duvivier and Marcel Denet. Jean Petit, Maurice Lemaire, Marcel Dean, Armand Duvivier, André Duromier all came from the same interregion. They were sent to lead other interregions. The application of their methods of sabotage on the railroads opened up the possibility of a real battle on the rails in the northern zone for more than 2 years. The real battle on the rails in the northern zone began precisely after the above method was put into practice. Operations were conducted in such a manner that a large crane had to be brought to the scene of an echelon derailment by the authorities, thus delaying the start of repair and recovery operations as much as possible. 11 train derailments were staged in the northern zone after the Allied troops landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943. Train delays totaled 325 hours on all lines, 200 cars and 24 locomotives were destroyed, 7 military echelons were attacked by armed men, and 200 Nazi soldiers were killed and 600 wounded in one day. Remembering the operation in Meaux, I imagine the tall, stately figure of the kindly Jean Petit, who cared not only about the battle affairs, which he prepared and carried out in the best possible way, but also about all the problems of life of the soldiers, their families, as well as relatives of those who fell in the fight. I also remember Maurice Lemaire, who, together with Armand Duvivier, was the first leader of the interregion of the Somme, Oise, Seine-Maritime, Calvados, Aire-et-Loire, Manche. A veteran of the 1914 to 1918 war, wounded several times, awarded the Military Cross and the Military Medal, Maurice Lemaire was an honest, intelligent man of fine intelligence and great courage. On July 4, 1942, after a year of struggle, he and his eldest son were arrested in Coutances. They managed to escape, but the son sprained his ligaments while jumping. His father carried him on his back almost all night, then hid him in a barn. In the morning, he talked to the farmer, who promised to keep everything secret, and exactly 1 hour later went to the Gestapo. October 1st, 1942, Maurice Lemaire and his eldest son were shot in the prison of St. Lo. Lemaire's wife was orphaned. Her husband and 3 sons, all 4 of them communists, had given their lives for their homeland and freedom. After her release, she wrote to Armand Duvaivier, "I was able to talk to some people from St. Lo prison who knew Maurice. They said that he was respected by all. To death he went courageously," addressed a brief speech to his comrades. 16-year-old son of Lema Charles joined the company Frontiers and partisans to avenge his father and brother. He fought heroically. Participated in one of the most sensational operations, the attack on the Hotel Royal on Christmas night 1942. In the evening of December 24th, 1942, a huge explosion and a powerful flash simultaneously shook and illuminated the whole of Amiens. A unit of Frontiers and partisans planted 2 huge mines under the Hotel Royal, which had been turned by the Germans into a soldiers' club. 200 German officers, non-commissioned officers, soldiers and female auxiliaries were feasting there at the time. Our Frontiers and partisans created in Amiens a real mine depot. For the operation was used so-called package, that is, a bundle of 2 mines. The charge was powerful, more than 10 kilograms of explosives. The group under the command of Jean Petit included Charles Lemaire, Émile Baguette, André Loluc, Lucien Joron, Gisèle Dujardin, and others, a total of 10 fighters. The mines were placed at a large window, quite close to the tables at which the throaty gang was celebrating Christmas. At 9:15 of the evening the charge exploded, and shrapnel, pieces of thick glass, and fragments of furniture flew in all directions. Émile Baguette and André Laloux were already far away when the city shuddered with the explosion. With tears of joy in their eyes they embraced. Baguette said, "We have avenged our victims, for Lemaire, for Keitel." Official reports said that 33 officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers were killed, and more than 50 wounded. In 1942, the struggle was not only in Paris and the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais. In response to repression, a real popular front was being created throughout occupied France. In all the cities and soon in the countryside, popular avengers rose up to fight, and the Nazis continued their massacres. On August 24, 1942, in the Hotel Continental again began its sessions of the German military court. 33 Frontiers and partisans, including 4 women, were convicted. Among the accused were Pierre Ribière and comrades from the Maine-et-Loire department, Jean Viala, the Frontiers from the southwest and the Loire adjoining areas, and Constance Ranino from Paris, and those arrested in her case. The chiefs of the special brigades and of the chief information services, David and Rott, subjected all the defendants to terrible torture. The Gestapo representative Thomas took an active part in this. These wild beasts tortured Georges Favreau to death. Antoine Emorin and Rochereau committed suicide to end the torture. The trial took place in a large hall hung with swastika flags and a huge portrait of Hitler towering over it all. The defendants were not allowed to have lawyers. Nazi officers and non-commissioned officers acted as judge and defense counsel at the same time. Opposite the bench on a table were displayed the weapons and explosives seized in our laboratory in the Rue de Baïdoire, and since the Nazis had not yet succeeded in capturing Jules Dumont, they had placed here his cap from the uniform of a soldier of the International Brigades, as an exhibit. 18 Frontiers were sentenced to death and shot on October 5, 1942. From prison, Pierre Ribière wrote stirring letters, one of which was about the future of his native village of Dordogne. He wrote that it was necessary to conduct electricity and install telephones in the homes of some poor people, to establish trade in manufactured goods, to make a water supply, to turn the castle into a rest home for the elderly and pregnant women, to plant the roads with fruit trees, to develop those industries that are needed here, to give young people stadiums, swimming pools, libraries. A few hours before his execution, the communists thought of a happy tomorrow. On August 20th, 1942, just a few days before the trial at the Continental Hotel, another fighter of the international brigades was taken to the Gestapo. This was a German, an anti-fascist, a veteran of the labor movement in Germany, Franz Dahlem. In 1937, one of the leaders of the Comintern, Georgy Dimitrov, offered Franz to head the operational secretariat of the German Communist Party in France. Maurice Lebert told me that he was struck by the large number of Germans who often came to Draveil. It turned out that it was in Draveil before the war held the Second Congress of the CPG during its stay in the underground. Its sessions were attended by Wilhelm Pieck, the future president of the GDR. At the same time, several CPG training schools were established. After studying in them, German communists were sent directly to Germany. These remarkable fighters and all those who fought in Germany against Hitler and his gang from 1933 to 1945 should be honored. Although the resistance movement in the occupied countries was still gaining strength, 300,000 German anti-fascists had already died in concentration camps. In 1942, Franz Dahlem was thrown into the Mauthausen concentration camp. Franz was born on January 14, 1892 in Rohrbach-le-Beach. He worked as a sales clerk in Cologne, found a family there and was active until the 1914 to 1918 war in the Social Democratic Party and was secretary of the Young Socialists' Union. In 1919, he was elected municipal councillor of Cologne as an independent German socialist. As soon as the German Communist Party was established, he joined its ranks. Dahlem was a deputy to the Reichstag. After that, he was continuously elected as a deputy until the elections of March 5, 1933, which took place already under the terror of the brownshirts, as Hitler came to power in February. In 1939, despite the fact that he was fighting against Nazism, Franz and all his fellow anti-fascists from the international brigades were arrested by the French authorities. They were housed in a stadium in Colombes, then transferred to Roland-Garros. In 1940, Dahlem was interned at Camp Vernet, then placed in Castres prison. On August 4, 1942, Pétain handed him over to Hitler, along with Luigi Longo, Siegfried Riedel, and Raoul. Two Vichy police officers took them, shackled, from Toulouse to Moulins, where they were handed over by the Vichy police to the Gestapo. They were then brought back to Paris, first thrown into Fresnes prison and then into Cherchy Midi. On August 20, 1942, anti-Nazi fighter Franz Dahlem was taken to Gestapo chief Bommelberg. At first, Franz was asked to tell about the activities of the FCP. He answered all questions in the negative. Then he was offered to condemn the actions of the French frontières, but he refused. Bommelberg said to him, "Well, all right. Let's talk frankly. I am well aware of who you are. I know what instructions are given to the communists in case they fall into our hands. When I was still in the police force of Socialist Minister Severin, my duties included the surveillance of the Reichstag deputies. Let's talk without secrecy. Do you know about martial law?" And Franz goes on to say, "I pretended not to know and answered, 'No, I was isolated in Fresnes prison, and I know nothing.' Then said Bommelberg in a triumphant tone, 'I will inform you that tonight we let the English go down like rats during their attempt to land at Dieppe. We captured all their weapons.' Then, pointing to a large map of the USSR hanging on the wall behind the table, Bommelberg exclaimed, 'Look where our armies are. In a few days we will be in Stalingrad. Then we will take the Caucasian oil. Moscow? Leningrad? We'll bypass them, it's not important. The Russians will die of hunger and cholera there. Mr. Dahlem, the world revolution is over. What do you say to that?' 'I don't believe a word of what you say,' I replied, and then explained why Hitler, like Napoleon in his time, would lose the war. 'You hope,' I continued, 'to hold the bulk of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine and Belarusia. This is your main mistake. For a long time, the USSR has been preparing for your attack. Its industrial base is in the Urals and Siberia. Huge military and human resources of the USSR have not yet been put into battle. Your airplanes cannot bomb the Urals. Moscow and Leningrad? You were forced to retreat at Moscow, and Napoleon managed to enter it. Leningrad has been on the defensive for a year. Inwardly I rejoiced, feeling that this Nazi's faith in victory was waning. A few months after Franz Dahlem was sent to the Mauthausen concentration camp, Bonelberg learned of the defeat at Stalingrad. Perhaps he further reflected on what had been said at that meeting and realized the weakness of those who still continued to torture and kill both in France and elsewhere in Europe. Now the Nazis felt more and more strongly how the wind was increasing, bringing them defeat. On March 3, 1942, Allied aircraft bombed the Renault factories, causing considerable damage. 623 residents of Boulogne-Billancourt were killed and 1,500 wounded. I was still living in the Rue Varaz at number 20. From the window of my room, as from an observation post, I watched the bombing. It was as bright as daylight, and I suddenly thought that the Citroën factories, near where Edwidge and Cécile lived, might also be hit. I quickly left the house through the back door and headed for No. 5 Rue Law Seville. With difficulty I persuaded Edwidge and Cécile to go down to the subway. But the Citroën factories had not been bombed, and I worried in vain about my own. A week later we received terrible news my father-in-law Maurice Romagun was shot on March 7th as a hostage. Along with him, 4 patriots from among the prisoners of the Clairvaux prison fell from the fascist bullets. René Legault, a communist councillor of the municipality of Paris, Paul Cabassier from Chalon-sur-Saône, Félicien Parisette from Monceau-les-Mines, and Bernard Roy from Dijon. 3 other communists were shot earlier on September 24, 1941, Alexis Collin from Yvennes-les-Lômes, and on January 13, 1942, Leon Fraud and Constant Petitjean. For Edwidge, it was a heavy blow. Her son Pierre had been sent to Germany, and now it was her father's turn. For a few days we were knocked out, but the survivors were obliged to carry on the work begun by our fallen comrades. Maurice Romagun was born on July 27, 1886, in the town of Rézy. He was 56 years old when he was shot by the Nazis. He grew up in a well-to-do family. His father, who died in 1899, owned a woodlot and a sawmill that employed several dozen labourers. When he turned 13, Maurice was left alone with his mother, 3 sisters and brother Raymond. He went to work in the sawmill very young. Driven by a desire to better master his chosen craft, he left in his 18th year with a travelling sawmill and travelled all over France. Cécile often recalls how, as a teenager, she listened to his stories about the coastal cliffs of Saint. André, about Harfleur, about Le Havre, the most blooming city in France, as he said, and other cities where he had to visit. Thus Maurice met new people, new places, new ideas, and joined the Socialist Party. He was called up for military service in the artillery. After his service he returned to Rézy to the familiar trade of a woodcutter. Because of his beliefs he was ostracized from his family. His mother disinherited him. In 1910 the wine growers revolted. The merchants of Reims Champagne made wine from grapes grown in Epernay, but they refused to call it champagne and paid less than they should. The riot was growing. The red flag was raised on the bell tower of the church of Rézy-Bar. All the bells were rung. Processions formed on all roads. Manifestants from Rézy-Bar, Rézy-au-Terrif, Rézy-Autun, the neighbouring settlements converged in one powerful column. Maurice and Edwidge were among them. With red flags, the demonstrators moved towards the city. They approached from all directions, and the columns grew as they advanced. In front of the local prefecture they numbered in the thousands, and the authorities were forced to admit the delegates. the demonstration, which had originated in the remotest corners of the Oba, took on an extraordinary character, becoming a popular celebration. In the cafes of Bar Sursine they drank, ate and sang table songs. Maurice and Edwidge returned to Risey only the next day. They were engaged in a struggle against social injustice. Mrs. Romagon was still angry. Oh, those demonstrations! That red flag on the church of Risey Bar, her son among the demonstrators. Moreover, he wants to marry the gardener's daughter, Romagon. It made her blood boil. On September 23, 1911, Edwidge and Maurice were married. And exactly a year after their marriage, Cecile was born. And another year and a half later, Pierre was born. In 1914, Edwidge was left alone with 2 children in her arms. She worked from morning till night. While serving in the army, Maurice went through a lot of trouble. As an artillery sergeant, he refused to open fire with a 75mm gun on positions held by rebellious French infantrymen. He was tried by a court-martial, but fear of publicity saved him from death. He was only demoted and became a private gunner again. More than once Maurice was subjected to disciplinary action, and maybe he would have had a bad time if the war had not ended. Back in Orbe, he got a job as a foreman at the sawmill in Neval-sur-Seine, a few kilometres from Risey. It was hard to be a foreman with his convictions, and the family moved to Saint-Julien-le-Ville, where Maurice was hired to work in the sawmill of the Guyot brothers. It was a large sawmill. Many Poles and Portuguese worked there. They lived in boarded-up barracks next to the sawmill. Except for the little Romagons, no one visited their children or the place where they lived because they were foreigners and ate fish soup. Here, too, the struggle in defense of workers' rights was not commensurate with the demands of the landlords. Maurice lived next door to the Guyot brothers and was on good terms with them, but nevertheless left their enterprise and took a job in another sawmill. He felt that one of the bandsaws was not working safely, and he declared that until a safety fence was installed, he would not allow anyone to work on it. And he ensured that the necessary health and safety measures were put in place. In 1930, an economic crisis hit. When Maurice was 44 years old, he learned a specialty as a moulder in the textile industry. It was a difficult job, paid by the piece, and he had to work at an ever-increasing pace. Taking advantage of the Lucia law, Maurice Romagon built a good house and planted a large garden on Philippi Street. After work, he devoted a lot of energy to his garden. Edwidge raised chickens, rabbits, took care of pigeons and a goat. In hard times of economic crisis, the household was an especially necessary help. My father-in-law was elected district councillor of the 3rd Canton, which included part of the town of Tours, Saint-Julien-le-Ville and other settlements in the southern suburbs. The unfolding crisis forced Maurice Romagon to retrain again. Now he became a newspaper carrier to the homes of the canton, from which he was elected deputy. He led propaganda in defense of communist ideas, and soon, thanks to him, increased subscriptions to the newspaper L'Aiguille, the organ of the French Communist Party. At first he made a good living, but times were hard for people of labour, and Maurice was not always able to collect money for the publications distributed. Cecile went to work in the factory from the age of 13. When she left for work, her father was just returning from his rounds. Every family had to receive a newspaper in the morning. Thus, thanks to this schedule, Maurice had time to do his work as a deputy. In September 1939, when Jean Flavian was called up for military service, my father-in-law was appointed head of the party federation of the department d'Aube. In March 1940, the government, which was preparing to surrender the country to the German occupiers, arrested him as a foreign spy, even though he was fighting in the ranks of the party against fascism. Thus he was first imprisoned in Troyes, from where he was transferred to Dijon prison. After the end of hostilities, he found himself a prisoner of war, but he managed to escape. Maurice returned to Saint-Julien-le-Ville, where Edwidge and Cecile arrived at the end of July 1940. Jean Bayeux, then secretary of the district party organization, made contact with him. CCL, who was present at their conversation, recalls that what was said was about the three tasks facing the party at that time: distributing central newspapers, and especially leaflets with the proclamations of Maurice Thorez and Jacques Duclos, printing newspapers and leaflets, facilitating the escape of prisoners of war, many of whom were in or across the department of Orbe, collecting weapons abandoned by the troops. Under the leadership of Maurice Romagon, many arms and ammunition depots were established. Nazi documents show that even then the Germans were already in fear of the workers of Troyes, Romilly and the Orbe department. A directive sent by the German authorities to the mayor of Troyes at the very beginning of the occupation said, "The civilian population is strictly forbidden to assemble in groups and hold street processions on Sunday, July 14th. I demand the most careful attention to ensure that calm is maintained on that day, otherwise the order will be given to open fire." The first issue of La Dépêche de l'El Lopu was published in August 1940. It dealt with the distress of the population. It also emphasized that entire neighborhoods of Troyes were destroyed and many families were homeless. 80% of construction workers were unemployed, as were many textile workers, and war veterans, who received only 50 francs a month in benefits, were facing hardship. The article ended with a call for the formation of popular committees to combat destitution everywhere. Other articles in this issue wrote about the unfairness of the actions of the owners at some construction sites and factories. One of the articles demanded the restoration of destroyed houses, compensation for losses to victims of war. The newspaper talked about the struggle to meet the urgent demands of workers, peasants and traders. In fact, the articles published were a preparation for the unfolding of the workers' struggle on a national scale. The occupiers and the Vichyists understood the meaning of the newspaper's speeches. The report of the Chief Commissioner of September 26, 1940, addressed to the Prefecture of Orbe, the Public Prosecutor's Office of Troyes, and the Mayor's Office, said the following: "In connection with my previous reports concerning the distribution of leaflets in Troyes, I have the honor to inform you that 2 new leaflets have appeared in recent days. It is quite evident that these leaflets are issued directly in our city or its vicinity. Only a small number of leaflets have been collected so far, and it is impossible to determine how many were printed. Leaflets have been found in mailboxes or under store doors. It is clear that they are being distributed during the night or early morning hours. Patrols organized to catch the perpetrators in the act have so far yielded no results. Following the direction given to me, I intend to search some houses." Chief Commissioner. The following report from the same commissioner was sent to the Prefect of Orbe, the Procureur de la République, and the Mayor of Troyes on September 29th. "I bring to your attention that, according to information emanating from a reliable source, the Communists have organized the collection of arms left behind by the French army throughout the territory for the purpose of setting up clandestine depots for subsequent action. The arms depots are not placed in the homes of activists, but in specially chosen locations to avoid detection by the police. On November 28, 1940, the following circular was sent to all prefectures of the Vichy Security Service. A report from the prefect of the Department of Orbe informs us, on the basis of reliable information, that on the instructions of the Communist Party, the collection of arms left behind by the French army has been organized in order to form strike groups of 6 to 8 men. On September 5, 1940, the first meeting of activists of the Department DU took place in Saint-Julien-le-Ville. There were 10 of them: Maurice Romagon, Jean Neve, Charles Masson, Pierre Romagon, Eugene Kian, Charles Alfred, Auguste Léonard, Alice Cuvier, Emilia Fufa, and Alphonse Schonenberger. Madeleine Dubois later joined the management team. Alice Cuvier and Eugene Kian often recall this meeting, the only one where so many leaders were present and where new decisions were made about the work of the underground organization, propaganda, and other communist activities. Also at the origin of the resistance movement in the Aube department were Germaine Moreau and her daughter, the Gervais family, Louise and Jules Ferrouy, the Pavoyal couple and their son André, Suzanne Parise and her son André, and Gaston and Roger Thuillier. Gaston Thuillier of Montigny-Lemont collected weapons abandoned by French troops. In 1940, at the behest of Maurice Romagon, he created an arms depot. Not far from his garden, in a vacant lot, he hid rifles, carbines, hand-held machine guns, carefully greased and wrapped in rags, in the areas of Mussy, Larizy, Romige, and in the forest from Roland and Robert Dieu. In many places were also created warehouses, most of which later served the partisans. Maurice Romagon even offered to collect shells. We were subsequently able to blow up a number of locks and other structures using these shells with detonators. Raymond Romagon, Cécile's younger brother, a member of the Central Committee of the Union of Communist Youth, had been in an illegal situation since 1939. He was actively involved in the restructuring of the organization of the Union of Communist Youth in each zone. He was succeeded in the Aube department by Léon Grand, Léon Jouvet, and his brother, André Chevoy, André Paris. In September 1940, when he was barely 15 years old, André Paris bicycled to Paris to pick up progressive publications for distribution in the Aube department. After stowing them on his trunk, he drove them from Paris to Troyes. Gaston Gagnaire, one of the heroes of the resistance movement in the Aube department, led a group of brave labor activists in a railroad depot. He was killed in action in August 1944. Pinegrini was in charge of transporting illegally published newspapers and leaflets to Romilly and Vallenox. The machinist Roger, together with Manique, the brothers Cain, Bazin, Legras, Clavier, and dozens of others in 1940 to 1941 organized the first sabotage in the depot and distributed newspapers and leaflets. It is impossible to enumerate all those who, from the second half of 1940, participated in the activities of the group in Troyes. But I think it is necessary to name among them Marcel Blanson, René Romagon, Robert Ortelli, Marcel Knoll, Georges Ayo, Georges Dyer, Abel Chancerel, and Alphonse Jenin. The Alsatian Eugene Kian, one of the leaders of the Workers' Gymnastics Federation and a proven communist, was given a special assignment to conduct anti-fascist propaganda among the soldiers of the Wehrmacht. In 1940 to 1941, he drafted leaflets in German. One of the leaflets said 10 Germans will pay with their lives for 1 Frenchman killed. These leaflets appeared in German troop locations and in officers' mess halls. With the help of Jacques Janis, Eugene Kian managed to get a job at the mayor's office in Troyes. He was in charge of the accounting and working staff engaged in sorting the property looted by the Nazis in homes, warehouses, and factories in France. Not all typewriters reached Germany. Many remained in Troyes and served the resistance fighters against the occupiers. The typewriters were kept by Suzanne Paris in Troyes and by Jean Neve in Rouly-Saint-Loup. In July 1940, Germaine Moreau began typing newspapers and leaflets on one of the rotaries. Soon there were difficulties with paper. André Parise got some white paper from a butcher's shop. The change in the quality of the paper did not escape the discerning eye of the chief commissioner. In a report addressed to the prefect of the Department of Aube, dated September 30th, 1940, he wrote, "With regard to the case outlined in previous reports concerning the distribution of communist leaflets in Troyes, I have the honor to hand you 2 new leaflets. One is called To the Unemployed, the other appealed to women. During the past night, several copies have been slipped under doors or thrown into mailboxes. These leaflets, as well as the earlier ones, are printed on a rotator. It is noticed that the same multiplying machines are used, but the latest leaflets were not printed on special, but on ordinary commercial paper. The observations continue. I have involved the gendarmerie in this work. The gendarmes from Saint. Julien Leville arrived at the house in the Rue Philippe. My father-in-law wasn't home. You have nothing, of course. No weapons, no typewriters, no leaflets? They asked Edwidge and Cecile. Of course not. And in the cellar? There's only some coal. The gendarmes left without searching. And there was so much material under the coal. After the arrival in the city agents of special brigades led by Jacquet and Chief Commissioner Brunet, the situation changed. On October 10, 1940, Brunet, who had arrested Cecile's father in March 1940, appeared with a group of agents in a house on Rue Philippe. Cecile was ill, bedridden. Brunet and his agents searched the whole house, even the chimney, but they could not find anything. And yet, in the early morning, my father-in-law was arrested in front of the Petit Troyen publisher's office, where he had gone to get some newspapers. Edwidge was taken in for questioning, but quickly released. Germaine Moreau, her daughter, and Charles Alfred were also arrested. The party immediately took action to free those arrested and prevent further arrests. In one night on October 12, 1940, groups formed by Maurice Romagon in Troyes distributed thousands of leaflets entitled Freedom for the Arrested. One of our best comrades, Maurice Romagon, as well as the workers Charles Alfred and Germaine Moreau they read, have been arrested without reason, by denunciation. The reactionary elements of our city can reproach Comrade Maurice Romagon only for his straight and honest way of life. At the end of the leaflet it said, "People are thrown into prisons without trial, as in the Middle Ages. Brutal repression continues to fall on workers fighting for freedom and the right to life. Workers of Troyes, do not let the best of you be arrested." On October 14, 1940, the Chief Commissioner wrote the following in his report. As in previous reports on the question of the distribution of communist leaflets in Troyes, I have the honor to report that yesterday afternoon a resident of the Rue Charles Groot brought a copy of the enclosed new leaflet which he found in his mailbox. It protests against the recent arrests of party activists. The search for the underground printing press continues. Here is the text of the second leaflet. The communists are accused of allegedly having no homeland, but it is not the communists who betrayed and led to the defeat of our country. It is not they who caused our people, forced to live under foreign occupation, brought to humiliation. Citizens of our city, workers of Troyes. Distribute petitions demanding the release of Germaine Moreau, Charles Alfred and Maurice Romagon. Join neighborhood committees in your homes and factories. Inaction and silence mean complicity with the enemy. The freedom of the workers depends on your actions. A form of display of courage by many people, communists and non-communists, was that they came to Philippe Street at the risk of their lives. They brought Edwidge the food they had collected, and once they even brought a whole load of firewood. The first page of the November 1940 issue of La Dépêche de l'Aube is devoted entirely to the struggle against repression. In addition, one of the articles protested against the 400 million francs in contributions levied daily for the maintenance of the occupation troops. Along with the propaganda work, workers' demonstrations in factories were organized and strikes were held. The first signs of armed struggle began to appear. Worker Raymond Ozat was shot on December 21, 1940, for attacking a German soldier. On January 2, 1941, young patriots fired on German soldiers in Union Square. The government took a number of measures. A curfew was imposed in the city from 8 o'clock in the evening. Mayor Charles was recalled from his post and René Bellemire was appointed in his place. As the Tribune de l'Aube wrote on January 3, 1941, at the request of the occupation authorities. A protest movement against German troops, led by the Union of Communist Youth, was also growing in Troyes. On January 5, 1941, the Tribune de l'Aube printed an article entitled Observance of the Rules of Conduct Towards German Officers. Here is an excerpt from that article. It has been noticed that young men in the main streets of the city refuse to give way to officers of the German army, directly and openly obstructing them. Up to now, this has not been given due attention. After the usual threats, the following was said in the collaborationist newspaper as an admonition to the young. It is strongly recommended to observe the elementary rules of behavior, which prescribe giving way to elders and representatives of the military authorities. But which military authorities? And into what form are patriotic actions put? And Prefect Gilher could not refrain from rebuking the patriots. A few days ago, he said on February 3, 1941, there was a rumor that the occupation authorities had decided to take a census of the male population from 18 to 45 years of age. Despite refutations in the press, this groundless rumor continues to spread in the city of Troyes. More serious is the fact. The servile official continued that in Troyes citizens have been found and detained by the police in possession of weapons and live ammunition and plotting against the German troops. They are mostly young men who by their criminal actions pose a great danger to the local population. The prefect ended his message with words of unyielding will, of dignity and discipline. On February 5, 1941, he announced a decree banning street traffic from 8 o'clock in the evening to 7 o'clock in the morning. Following the Chief Commissioner's declaration of communist activity, arrests immediately followed. On Brunet's orders, 2 women accused of pasting tricolour flags and other young communists were arrested. Yet the printing and distribution of leaflets and illegal newspapers continued. On February 27, 1941, the newspaper Petit Troyen published an article entitled Communist Propaganda. It stated, Maurice Romagon, 54, and his wife, as well as Mrs. Moreau, née Germaine Gentilhomme, 43, and her daughter are accused of spreading the slogans of the Third International. Since June 1940, Romagon had authored pro-communist articles. These articles were published in leaflets. Romagon's wife printed the leaflets on a hectograph. Maurice Romagon's wife and Mrs. Moreau's daughter acted as liaisons. The defendants pleaded guilty, but Romagon excused himself on the grounds that the articles the prosecution has in mind were written by him at a time when he was under the influence of others, and were polemical in nature. And yet my father-in-law was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Edwidge, Germaine Moreau and her daughter were released. At the beginning of 1941, while Maurice Romagon was in Clairvaux prison, the Communist Party intensified its activities to mobilize the workers to fight for freedom and independence. In May 1941, the Chief Commissar attached to his report to the prefect a leaflet entitled The Communist Party Appeals to All Frenchmen who think in French and wish to fight in French to create a national independence front. The leaflet began as follows: French women and Frenchmen, fight against national oppression, for France to remain France and not a colony. We extend a fraternal hand to all Frenchmen of goodwill. It concluded by saying, the Communist Party puts the interests of the country above all else and solemnly declares that in order to create a broad front of national liberation, it is ready to support the French government, that any organization and any figure whose actions are aimed at a genuine struggle against national oppression, against the traitors who serve the invaders. War with the Soviet Union had not yet been declared. When it was on June 22, 1941, Prefect Gilher was in full swing. Here is the full text of his letter to the Chief Commissar of July 10th. On the basis of Article 10 of the Penal Code, I ask you to make thorough and simultaneous searches of the homes of Communist Party activists, according to the attached list. If communist or Gaullist leaflets or propaganda material is found, the perpetrators must be arrested immediately. The records of all arrests should be forwarded to me. The searches are to begin on Monday, July 14th. Prefect Auberge Geiler. The pro-Nazi weekly La Garbe of August 14th, 1941, published an article about the first wave of repression against communists in the department of Aube. On July 14th of this year, searches were made in the homes of 600 communists living in Troyes. It was found that 72 communists had been imprisoned in Clairvaux prison at the very beginning of the war. It took 6 months to prove that the fighters of the illegal front resumed their activities immediately after leaving prison. Among the trophies were a red flag, red handkerchiefs with embroidered sickle and hammer, 2 typewriters, 2 rotators, printing equipment, paper, copy paper, pre-war propaganda materials, and 300 kilograms of leaflets. Fortunately, Edwidge and Sile had already been hiding for 3 weeks in an illegal apartment in Reims, where I found them after my escape from captivity. In the months that followed, the Communists called for the expansion of the National Front. The newspaper Le Front au Bois, the departmental organ of the National Front, agitated Catholics to join the resistance movement. The newspaper wrote, "The truth is being hidden from you. The arrest of a patriot priest from St. Germain des Prés of Breton priests, of 140 priests of Alsace, among whom is Hebert, former secretary to Bishop Rauch of Strasbourg, who was exiled with the bishop for his courage and patriotism, are being concealed from you. Catholics of the Department of Aube, listen to the underground radio program for Christians on Sundays, Tuesdays and Fridays. Follow the glorious example of your former bishop. Come over to our side." The appeal was also made to former members of the Socialist Party. "You have been abandoned and deceived. The former district party worker Gossot is now one of the activists of the French National Popular Party of the Department of Aube, masking its Nazi nature. It is not with such people that France will take its rightful place. Genuine members of the French Socialist Party, do not answer the calls of these rascals. Your place is among us." Next came an appeal to the radicals. "In your newspaper, Petit Troyen, Goebbels' speeches are printed in bad French, although the leadership of the newspaper has not changed. You have nothing in common with these people. Come over to our side." The same appeal extended a fraternal hand to the socialists, in whose ranks there was at that time complete disorder and vacillation. Indeed, while Professor Pierre Brossolette took the path of struggle, another professor, Albertini, one of the leaders of the Federation of Socialists of the Department of Aube, had since 1940 become the deputy of the Traitor d'Aix. Another prominent figure of the Socialist Party, Douait, accepted the appointment as mayor of Troyes in the years when others were falling under the bullets of punitive squads at Montaguy and Clairvaux. In the winter of 1941/42, I travelled to Troyes, where Maurice Romagan lived and fought. 2 courageous men led the special organisation in the departments of Marne, Orbe, Côte d'Or, Yonne, and in the occupied part of the department of Saône and Loire. Charles Grosperin was the political commissar, and Lucien Dupont was the military commissar of the interregion. Lucien had been engaged in political struggle from an early age. In 1939, he was arrested for distributing underground leaflets. On October 15, 1939, the Brive court gave him a suspended sentence of 1 year in prison. In June 1940, returning to Dijon, he became one of the leaders of the illegal organization of the Union of Communist Youth at the Pedagogical Institute, then joined the battalions of youth and moved to the special organization. December 28, 1941, in Dijon, Lucien shot from a pistol and seriously wounded German Lieutenant Winokur. On the night of January 11, 1942, he and his group, with the participation of Pierre Dubord and Serge Guy-Pampam from the Lipton factory, planted a bomb in a German soldiers' club in Dijon. On January 27th, he killed a Nazi soldier in Montceau-les-Mines, and on the 29th another in Montchenin. He became a wanted man, so he never appeared again in the departments of Côte d'Or and Saône-et-Loire. After he was appointed commissioner of the interregion, he remained for some time in the departments of Orbe, Marne, Yonne before being transferred to the Bordeaux area. The 3 of us gathered together on a winter night in 1941/42 in Quartier Billet, Rue Célestin-Filbois. All night we discussed the questions posed by our struggle in the 5 departments. In the morning I left by train for Paris. Charles Grosperin and Lucien Dupont repeatedly attacked guard posts, German soldiers, derailed trains on the lines Paris-Lyon, Paris-Basel and others. Charles Groisperin was arrested in the house of our friends Louise and Jules Ferry. According to my friend Eugene Kian, it happened on a February evening in 1942. He was handcuffed. He refused to go and sat on the floor, pretending to be injured. When a policeman went to get a cart to move him, Charles pulled out a revolver and shot the one who remained to guard him. He ran away in handcuffs. He was shot. The bullet hit him in the thigh. Despite the pain, the great loss of blood, and the handcuffs, he managed to cross the ice-covered river to reach the snow-covered forests of the Lanauges-Bois and Bouilly area. Eventually, he found shelter at the farm of Georges Bernard. There, the blacksmith removed his handcuffs. The next day, Charles went to Drancy, where he hid with the Chassing couple. After his recovery, he took over the leadership of the Franc-tireurs and partisans in a sector of the northern suburbs. Franc-tireur groups began to be established in the Aube department. Maurice Romagon was still in Clairvaux prison. On June 28, 1941, Léon Fraud, René Le Gall, the municipal councillors of Paris, Maître Caldor, then a law student, and many other communists arrested between 1939 and 1940, were brought to this prison handcuffed and shackled like convicts in prison cars. René Le Gall, Léon Fraud, Pierre Simard, Tournemain, Meur and dozens of others were extradited to the Germans in Bourges prison in June 1940. Maurice Romagon met with his comrades. Caldor later recounted, "Maurice met and encouraged us. He advised us to ask for work in a locksmith's shop. There we could better prepare for our escape. He himself was the owner of a workshop that made brushes, and he never missed an opportunity to keep in touch with us. He drew us a plan of the prison, explained how it was guarded, and how we could escape. The prison was divided into two parts. One was under the control of the French authorities. Communists were held there together with criminals. There were 250 of us. The other part of the prison was under the jurisdiction of the German authorities, and 1,500 people were held there, mostly members of the National Front or young criminals convicted of minor criminal offences for 2 or 3 years. Organised action soon succeeded in getting the communists placed separately from the criminals. We were allowed to turn on the light in the evenings to read, and we were allowed to practice French, English, Spanish, and math. Our Italian comrade lectured us on the history of the international labour movement. The fact that my hands are intact I owe to your father-in-law. René Le Gallame and I were going to be forced to saw trees. But Maurice said, "Don't go there. Everyone who works there has no fingers. We refuse to work." The overseer was furious. René Le Gall told him, "Don't equal us. We'll need our hands when we get out of here." We were put in the punishment cell for 45 days. Thanks to the solidarity of our comrades, we were returned to our cells after 17 days. In prison, too, the communists acted in an organised manner. Their cohesion became even stronger when Léon Fraud, René Le Gall and Maurice Romagon were appointed as leaders. In September 1941, the Vichyists ordered the execution of the hostages. Léon Fraud knew that he was first on the list, Maurice Romagon was second, René Le Gall was third. On January 13, 1942, Léon Fraud fell to a Nazi bullet. Now my father-in-law was first in line. Many prison guards sympathized with communists and resistance fighters. One night, 2 warders entered my father-in-law's cell. "You're about to be shot because you're first on the hostage list. We offer you an escape. At midnight, during the midnight shift, you will be given a warden's uniform, and you will come out with us." Maurice Romagon asked for 10 minutes to think. When the warders returned, he told them, "No, for instead of number 1, number 2 will go. I'm 56 years old. Let it better be me than a young one." On the morning of March 7, 1942, it was announced that 5 prisoners would be shot. The first was Maurice Romagon, the second was René Le Gall, followed by Paul Cabassier from Chalon-sur-Saône, Félicien Parisset from Monceau-les-Mines and Bernard Roy from Dijon. René Le Gall, knowing that he would die in a few minutes, still played his last game of checkers with Pierre Caldor. Maurice Romagan refused the more palatable food offered to him by the warders. "I shall die as easily as I have lived," he said. "I don't need any privileges to face death." Before his execution, he did not allow himself to be blindfolded. On March 7, 1942, the gunfire of the Punishers stopped the beating of this man's big heart. Maurice Romagan, one of the pioneers of the resistance movement in the department of Aube, a communist worker, was the first to die from Nazi bullets. Soon death caught up with the socialist Pierre Brossolette and the owner of a small knitting factory, Pierre Molson. They were from different walks of life and symbolized the alliance of patriots that was gradually being forged in the struggle for the liberation of France. In November 1941, my brother-in-law Raymond Romagan was assigned to work in the occupied zone. Under the pseudonym Roland, he led underground activities in the eastern interregion, which included the departments of Meurthe and Moselle, Haute-Marne, Vosges-Meuse. Raymond fought to restore the organizations of the Union of Communist Youth in the areas where they had ceased their work, to grow their ranks. But what occupied him most was the idea of armed struggle. Under Raymond's influence, many young communists in Lorraine joined the special organization. On February 4, 1942, the communists of Aubois and a group of members of the special organization blew up a power station and permanently stopped the work of industrial enterprises in the basin. 13 young Obu communists, led by Orlando Garatoni, were extradited by the traitor Paci and shot on July 29, 1942. They went down in the history of the youth struggle in the same way as the Lycée students of Paris and the students of the Pedagogical Institute in Dijon. In the city there is a monument erected in honor of the heroes of the youth communist and partisan movement. Aubois was on the border of the annexed areas. The first houses on the road to Metz were German. The person in charge of this area was René Favreau. He liaised with our organizations in the Moselle region through Aumecourt, where the work was carried out by the Waite brothers. In December 1941, Raymond gave me the task of getting in touch with our partisans in the annexed areas. As I recall, the work train passed through the department of Meurthe and Moselle every day, making its way from the occupied area to the annexed area and back again. This area, taken from France by Hitler, was famous for the heroism and courage of the Lorrainians. One of the most prominent fighters was the leader of the communist youth organization of the department of Meurthe and Moselle, Marcel Simon. Finding himself a prisoner of war after the end of hostilities, he escaped from an echelon bound for Germany. Marcel Nesch sheltered Marcel Simon at his home and helped him to obtain documents. Soon Marcel Simon managed to get a job in one of the largest German garages in Nancy, where all the cars of the occupants were parked. At the end of February 1941 in the evening, left alone in the garage, he punctured the gas tanks, and when the liquid spread in large quantities, he set fire to it. The entire garage burned down along with the cars. Naturally, Simon never returned to the garage again. Together with Marcel Beck, he left for the Vosges department. In May 1941, they blew up the German automobile park at Sept-Diou. In 1942, he led one of the first guerrilla groups in the Froude forest. There, Marcel was killed in a battle with the Gestapo. In the department of Meurthe and Moselle, the resistance movement, initiated by the working class, was widely developed. In Longwy, the leaders of the Union of Communist Youth were Joseph Caratoni and René Getty, veterans of the international brigades in Spain. Alba Petit, Ladislas Mendic, Louis Felicetti, Goffredo Cagliostri and other patriotic young communists of the Longwy district fought alongside them. Many of them gave their lives in this struggle. We must also mention Auguste Davip and José Daroche. They were sent to work in Germany and there they were arrested in a factory for sabotage. Auguste Davip died in a concentration camp in Neuengamme. The women and girls of Lorraine took an active part in the battle for France against foreign invaders. Marie-Louise Bergy, an insurance agency clerk in Longwy, printed underground newspapers and magazines. In June 1942, she was arrested and beheaded in a Hamburg prison. Women such as Maria Staub and Ijikura, Mariella Nest, Blanche Zeller, postal clerk Juliette Jonvo, Maria Derivo, who were party activists, sacrificed themselves to save their homeland. And how can we not remember the beautiful, young, smiling face of Solange Vigneron, a worker from Sinon in the Vosges department, who led the Union of French Girls? The Nazis arrested Solange and, despite her young age, beheaded her. It was in this area that Roland led the youth struggle for more than 6 months. We met occasionally. Sometimes we managed to spend a day together. After her father's death and Pierre's arrest, Edwidge was happy to have us at her place. We had 2 family problems to solve. Simone Jacquereau, Raymond's fiancée, stayed in the southern zone. Since Raymond had not been able to leave when he first took up his new duties in the northern zone, he needed to pass through the demarcation line. On the other hand, a serious danger threatened us from the Vichysts and Germans. They kidnapped children to blackmail their parents and even hijacked them to Germany. My son lived with his grandmother, and the authorities knew about my escape from the camp. After liberation, comrades brought my photograph posted in the commissariat of Vincennes and probably elsewhere with the inscription, "Terrorist to be exterminated." I shared with Eugene Jenaf our family problems. "If I were in your shoes," Eugene told me, "I would take every precaution and go to the southern zone to sort things out for myself. The longer you procrastinate, the harder it will be to do it." In the department of Cher lived my old regimental comrade Maurice Abioran, an enterprising, solid and brave man. The son of a middle-class peasant, he had come to the regiment with right-wing ideas. 2 years after his discharge from the service, he asked me what he had to do to join the Communist Party. He lived in Evora, near the demarcation line. On a January evening in 1942, I went to see him. He was in charge of the food supply in the canteen of the camp near where he lived. "Don't you need a plan of the airfield?" he asked me. "Nothing easier. I took this job to be useful." "I'll get to that later," Maurice, I replied. "We have people who deal with these matters. Right now, I'm asking you for a simpler favor. Help me cross the demarcation line." Maurice was already involved in the resistance movement at that time and had experience in conspiratorial work. We went out after dinner, late at night. We walked along the road, then along the highway. Suddenly Maurice stopped me and said, "Starting from here, the line runs through the forest. In 200 meters will be the southern zone, but you need to walk through the forest for a few kilometers to reach the nearest settlement." I cautiously made my way through these thickets, navigating by compass. At sunrise, after a long way through the snow, I reached the dunes sur Oron. I had no need to find out if I had gotten into the southern zone. I saw French soldiers near the camp kitchen. Naturally, I concealed my involvement in the resistance movement and introduced myself as a prisoner of war who had escaped from Germany. They offered me hot coffee, and soon we were engaged in a lively conversation. The soldiers had no sympathy for the Germans, but anything was to be expected, so I restrained myself. At night I arrived at Virieuc-le-Grand and boarded the train there. Fortunately, there was no document check. To avoid an unwelcome encounter with the police at the station, I jumped off as the train approached my destination. I was familiar with the area and easily found my way to the house where my mother lived. My mother, sister-in-law, and Simone rushed to meet me. They were very worried, and understandably so. In the morning, I was able to see my son Maurice. He was 1 year and 3 months old, nurtured and cherished by everyone, feeling great. I remembered showing his picture to a callous Austrian during my first attempt to escape, trying to pacify him. "My mother has decided to keep the baby." "What will you do with the baby? You lead such a life. Look how pretty he is. He'll be fine here." I should have explained to her that such rosy-cheeked children are taken away and sent to the ovens of Auschwitz. I had a wonderful day with my mother, my relatives, and my son. The problem of crossing the demarcation line was solved. A railroader from Chalon-sur-Seine and his wife, very nice people, agreed to take the child to Virieux, and we were then to come to Chalon to pick him up. In the afternoon, Raymond's fiancée went to Lyons to warn the Duchoy family of Villeurbanne that I would be staying with them for the night before we left for Paris. And at night I left by train for Lyon. The Duchoy family lived in one of those tall houses there called skyscrapers. We had been friends with them since 1938. The next day Simone and I left, taking our belongings with us. It was impossible to cross the demarcation line at Dunes-sur-Oron with our suitcases, but it was explained to us that getting into the northern zone was no problem since I had a Parisian Idaho card. We arrived in Chalon, and as we were about to leave the station room, German soldiers suddenly appeared. We had to spend the night in jail, endure 2 interrogations. We were sentenced to a week's imprisonment, but it was possible to pay a fine instead of serving the sentence. Fortunately, my mother gave me some money and I gave it to the Germans. We were released in the afternoon. If the Germans had checked my identity card, we would have been in trouble. But we had to get away from them at any cost. The Germans were happy to replace imprisonment with a fine, as the Chalon prison was overcrowded. We were given our belongings back and warned not to show up there again. After checking that we were not being followed, we went to our railroad friends to make arrangements for Maurice, and then left for Paris, where Simone was to meet Raymond, Cécile and Edwidge, whom she had not seen since June 1940. Thanks to the efforts of André Tessier and Conrad Guillard of Carré-le-Tombé, our Maurice was safe. Gallo and his wife Suzanne, peasants from Saint. Aubin had many children of their own, but these kind people took in orphans from the orphanage. Maurice's appearance to them caused them no perplexity. But no matter how nice these people were, Cécile and I were heartbroken when we left our child with them. During the summer of 1942, Cécile and I spent many Sundays at the Gallo family's large family farm. We walked with Maurice through the fields and woods. At first he was a little afraid of us, but then he got used to us. I remember Cécile and I sitting on the grass, picking wildflowers, playing with my son. In May 1942, Cécile managed to move to the Frontières. I was appointed National Military Commissioner in place of Georges Vallee, and in order to organize the detachments of the Frontières and the partisans, I had to ensure reliable and effective communication. This was handled on my behalf by Cécile, helping me to keep in touch with the members of the National Military Committee. It was only 2 years after we were married that we were finally able to live together for a while, to spend evenings together, to support and help each other. I owe a great deal to Cécile. At the end of March, before we resumed our life together, I had to change my residence and leave the house on Varie Street that I had come to love so much. I went to the countryside for a few days and forgot to close the water faucet. Naturally, the water penetrated into the rooms on the floor below. The concierge managed to get into my room through the window and shut the faucet. After my return, I faced the problem of changing my apartment. First of all, the poverty of my surroundings was ill-suited to the position of sales representative, and secondly, the concierge had been in my room and might have discovered a revolver stored under my mattress. I moved to Rue de Dardanelles, escaped without paying my landlady, taking with me a cot, sheets, blankets, and some linen. I do not know why, but in the neighborhood of Turney's, this street, and even this house made me uneasy. After 3 weeks, I decided to move again. I found a large room with a bathroom on the 2nd floor on Rue Mallard. I felt confident there. The concierge and the tenants were nice people. In May, when the nature of my work was settled, I began to look for a place to live for Edwidge, Cécile and myself. I gave a room in Rue Mallard to Raymond and Simone, and the three of us settled in Rue Colony, but not for long. There was a cafe on the first floor next door to our apartment, and we soon realized that it was a meeting place for black market peddlers. In June, we settled into a 2-bedroom apartment, as I expected we would for a long time. The apartment was on the 4th floor, at number 32 on Rue Piat. Rue Belleville near the metro station goes up, and Rue Piat is perpendicular to it. Not far from the intersection of these streets, on Rue Belleville, is the Pyrenees metro station. The apartment was excellent, not very expensive for us, people not rich, and very comfortable. In the evenings, when we left the metro station on Rue Belleville, we walked along the parallel deserted streets to make sure that we were not being followed. We felt we were safe. I repeat, it seemed. It was Saturday, June 20th, 1942. The whole family was supposed to meet at our house at noon, especially since Cecile had arranged to meet Raymond near our house. Raymond didn't show up for the meeting, and neither did Cecile. The alternate meeting place was the Pyrenees subway station. Edwidge was very worried about Cecile's long absence. Roundups were rampant in the city, and many members of the Union of Communist Youth had been arrested. Edwidge didn't want to wait any longer, so I went with her down Rue Piat to the intersection with Rue Belleville. It was only half an hour later that we saw Cecile, and she told me that Raymond had not come to the meeting. We walked down the Rue Piat again, and near the house Edwidge fainted. We picked her up and with great difficulty carried her to our apartment on the 4th floor. We put Edwidge to bed and began to bring her to her senses by applying vinegar-soaked cloths to her forehead and temples. "My poor Raymond has been arrested. That's for sure," she said to us as she opened her eyes. It is impossible to describe the anguish and suffering of a mother who had lost her beloved son. There were no tears, only mute pain. We sat together for a long time trying, despite everything, to keep hope in her heart, to make her believe in the impossible. It's hard to say what time we fell asleep. We awoke to a knock at the door. Concerned, I quickly jumped up. Dozens of activists of the Union of Communist Youth had been hunted down and arrested, including our leaders Baynak, Dipioy and Jian. Now, apparently, it was our turn. The click of the key being turned in the lock added to the alarm. We had forgotten that the key had been left in the door, so we thought it could only be the policeman. In our room we had a small suitcase, in which were a few photographs for documents and a notebook with notes, made by my hand, on how to prepare incendiary mixture. In another notebook was a description of a sabotage on the railroad with explanations of how to disconnect the rails. There were also several illegal newspapers and leaflets in the suitcase, as well as Henry Barbus's book Stalin. I opened the window. To the left, at the 3rd floor level, was the factory roof. I threw my suitcase onto it. As soon as I did so, Simone entered the apartment. She said that she had rushed to us since morning to reassure us. We learned from Simone that Raymond was unharmed and waiting to meet her at the Pyrenees metro station an hour later. I quickly put on my shoes, slipped my jacket over my shoulders, and went down to the carpenter who lived on the 1st floor. Saying that my son had thrown something on the factory roof, I asked him to give me a ladder. Hardly had I climbed onto the roof when suddenly I heard a whistling sound. I turned around and saw policemen below. As it turned out later, an inspector lived in the house across the street. He sent the cops, and we thought we were so safe. "What are you doing down there? Get downstairs at once." I went down, leaving my suitcase on the roof. After much bickering, the policeman said, "Come with us and take the ladder. You'll have to explain yourself at the police station." Before going with them, I quietly put my foot on the rung and pretended to adjust my shoelaces. Cecile, Edwidge and Simone were watching through the window. "We have to leave now," said Cecile. "He's let us know he's going to try to escape." Simone immediately went downstairs. My argument with the policeman was still going on. The carpenter, who didn't want his ladder taken away, intervened. I chose a moment, suddenly threw the ladder at the policeman and rushed down the street. Despite the early hour, there were many people. It was market day. Along the Rue Belleville to the Rue Piat were carts of greens. The policeman ran after me. The crowd prevented them from shooting. So they wouldn't think I was a thief, I shouted, "I'm an escaped prisoner of war." And the policeman echoed, "Seize him, he's an escaped prisoner of war." I was a few meters from the end of the street when I heard, "Run, boy. We'll apprehend the spies." I crossed Rue Belleville, ran out onto Rue Rebeville and looked around. There was no one around. I went into one of the houses and told the concierge that I had escaped from the POW camp. I asked her to help me escape from my pursuers. In response, she cried out and fell down on her back. She was immediately surrounded by some old women, and I jumped out into the courtyard and ran to the archway of a house on Belleville Street. I took off my jacket, hung it on the nail of the door, which was always open and pressed against the wall. And then I went out again and walked slowly toward the subway station to get to Rue Mallard. I hid near my former apartment and watched as Cecile, Edwidge, Simone and Raymond arrived there, one by one. Simone witnessed my escape. She first ran after the policeman and then came back and told Cecile and Edwidge that I had not been caught. She then went to the Pyrenees metro station to meet Raymond. As for Cecile and Edwidge, they waited it out for a while and then packed some things and left the apartment on the Rue Piat. For a few days, all five of us lived in one room in the Rue Mallard, and then with a printing worker, Jean Rivière, a friend of André Tessier, in number 10 Rue Carnot. Soon we took an apartment in Vincennes. It was a beautiful apartment, but we were unable to buy light disguising curtains, and one day we received a summons to appear immediately at the police station in Vincennes. The policeman assured us that the light was too conspicuous in the street. We should not have played with fire. We took our belongings and returned to our good Jean Rivière, asking him to shelter us again. A few days later, we managed to rent a furnished mansion in Villers-Juif. It belonged to the mother of some very good friends of ours by the name of Blanchard. She was living in Paris with her children at the time. Mrs. Blanchard's house was in a quiet place, and at nightfall Cecile would bring our comrades there. Here we would discuss the tasks ahead, and after curfew ended we would escort our comrades to the subway station by detours. In October 1942, I caught a cold and fell ill. The case was like this. I was returning from a meeting of the Interregional Military Committee of the Departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais by night train. The old wooden carriages were not heated, and, in addition, all the windows had been broken during the bombing. A strong wind was blowing, jets of cold air rushed into the compartment, and I caught a cold. When I got back to Villejuif, I had a fever that did not go down for several days. There were no antibiotics then. Cecile brought me to Dr. Albert, who was the head of the medical service of the Frontières and Partisans organization, and he told me that I needed an operation in my nasal cavity. At Dr. Albert's request, Professor Maspetiol placed me in a private clinic on the Boulevard Arago. No one there knew anything about me, and Prof. Maspetiol operated on me himself. Nevertheless, 2 days after the operation, I was asked for ration cards. I said I would get them, but to avoid trouble I asked the professor to discharge me. Having settled everything that was required, I left. Later, Professor Maspetiol removed my stitches at his apartment and did not charge me a centime for the operation. When I finally recovered, our family moved to Rue de Château. The house was in the middle of a park. We had 2 rooms on the first floor and 2 on the first floor. Unfortunately, the enclosed courtyard, surrounded on 3 sides by a grid about 5 meters high, would be a real mousetrap if the police came. The owners lived on Rue Santé. They were rentiers from the 16th arrondissement. They seemed to sympathize with me. Besides, I agreed to pay for the use of the furniture, which was to their advantage. I managed to get some firewood, so we were much warmer this winter than a year ago. In July, Raymond was transferred to the frontières and partisans. Under the leadership of Roger Linet, he carried out responsible assignments at the headquarters of the Paris district. He was forced to leave his apartment in the Rue Mallard and hid with Simone at one and another acquaintances, in particular Andrienne Ranson and Lydia Lemarchand in Agneres. At the end of October and beginning of November, Mrs. Blanchard allowed them to settle in Villejuif, where we met them occasionally. On Christmas evening in 1942, Andrienne invited Raymond and Simone over. The table was set. Simone and Andrienne waited for Raymond all night. It later transpired that he had been arrested on the outskirts of Villejuif by a German field gendarmerie post when the gendarmes were rounding up draft evaders. In January 1943, Raymond showed up in Compiègne with his brother Pierre and the secretary of the French Communist Party organization in the department of Alpes-Parigot. Pierre and Parigot recounted what had happened on Christmas Day. Despite beatings and severe torture, Raymond refused to testify. Moreover, the gendarmes had no evidence of his participation in the resistance movement. I had committed an unforgivable and fatal indiscretion. 3 weeks after Raymond's arrest, I learned from the landlady of the house where Raymond lived that the gendarmes had not visited it. I was sure that Raymond had been arrested accidentally and that he would not give up his address even under torture. On this basis, I thought that the house could be used again as a meeting place for our comrades. Alas, Raymond reasoned otherwise. The gendarmes had not found any evidence against him, but he assumed that during the past 3 weeks we had removed everything that could give us away and would not use it again. One day in late January, Cécile met with 3 of our comrades, René Mijo and 2 other leaders of the interregion, who had to be transported to the southern zone of the country because they were all wanted by the police. For the first time since Raymond's arrest, we all went together to Villejuif. The meeting began at 7 o'clock in the evening. We discussed the general questions of our struggle and the situation of our 3 comrades forced into hiding. Everyone was hungry, but there was nothing but potatoes in the house. About noon, when we were peeling potatoes, I suddenly heard the roar of a motor, although usually no cars appeared here. Through the window I saw a car with soldiers of the field gendarmerie, and there were Blanchard, the landlady, and Raymond. Neither of them suspected that there were people in the house. We had no weapons to fire on the Germans and try to free Raymond, we only had to run. While Mrs. Blanchard was looking in her purse for the key to the gate, we had time to go down into the cellar, and thence into the garden. "Shoot! Shoot!" shouted one of the gendarmes when he saw us. Under the fire of the gendarmes, we rushed to run deep into the garden. One of our comrades was wounded, but he quickly got up and ran after us. At such moments, a man seems to be possessed by a supernatural power. The same power must have possessed us as we literally waded through the thicket in the garden. At last we found ourselves on the Rue de la Paume and headed for Vitry. After running a short distance, we stopped to catch our breath. None of us was in a flourishing condition, but one of my companions was deathly pale. I patted him on the cheeks to make him a little pinker, otherwise his appearance might attract attention. Immediately we examined the wounded comrade. The bullet would have struck him in the heart, but the thick wallet was in the way, and it only grazed the skin a little. The mark of the bullet was more like a burn. In the evening we all met in Vincennes and finished the conversation we had started in Villejuif. To this day I feel remorse for my rashness and for not having been able to express to Raymond my admiration for his courage during the torture. Perhaps it was his courage that helped him to persevere through the difficult years in the concentration camp. In early 1945 he developed hemoptysis in the camp and died. From the accounts of his brother Pierre and Parigot, we know that Raymond took what happened in Villejuif hard, but it did not break his courage. They both saw his shirt, all ragged, barely covering his severe wounds. There was not a single living spot on his back. He had been tortured with electricity, but he said nothing and gave no one away. The Germans never learned his name. As for our friends Blanchard, they were not touched. Mrs. Blanchard repeated that she did not appear in Villejuif and did not know that anyone lived in the mansion. The beginning of 1943 was a harsh one for us. 2 weeks after the Villejuif incident, I had a meeting with a military commissar from Brittany in the Rue de Butte. This comrade, a trade unionist from Nantes, very well known in the area, had a large family. The commissioner of the Interregional Committee of the Communist Party warned me that he would visit his wife and children regularly. We had agreed on this as early as our previous meeting. I gave him money to rent a house in Finisterre for his family and advised him not to show his face in Nantes again. He promised me that. The party leaders in Brittany had a correct assessment of the situation. While the military commissar was in Paris, the policeman settled in his house, waiting for his return. The comrades tried to warn the commissar. They knew when he was due to arrive from Paris and came to the station. But the commissar, fearing an encounter with the police at the station, left the train not on the platform, but directly onto the track and went to his home. There he was captured. During our first conversation, we agreed that we would meet again at Rue des Bateaux in Nogent-sur-Marne. The day of our meeting with him came. I knew nothing about the arrests in the Department of the Atlantic Loire and in the Interregion. It was not possible for me to go with Cécile to this meeting. She had an alternate meeting that day with another comrade from Brittany who had failed to show up the day before. This was the reason for Cécile's concern about the outcome of my meeting. I said then that I knew this comrade, that he would not give anyone away, even if he were arrested. I arrived 10 minutes early and walked along the Rue des Bateaux. Suddenly, a few dozen meters ahead, I noticed a man in overalls standing at a shop window. I turned onto Rue François Roland and went out onto Rue Grey Rue, and from there back onto Rue Boat. On the other side of the street, at the place where we were to meet the comrade from Brittany, 4 young men appeared. They were walking from Perret in the direction of Fontenay Station. At the bus stop, 2 lingered, and the other 2 left. The young men seemed suspicious to me, but I said to myself, "You are beginning to have a persecution mania." Once more I left Rue Boat, walked through the adjoining streets, and re-entered Rue Boat at its intersection with Rue Mat. At the intersection of Rue François Hollande and Rue Butte, I saw the 2 boys. I had no doubt now that they were police agents, but they must have recognized me too. At 5 p.m., I had an appointment with Professor Marcel Preenan at Fontaine-sous-Bois. He lived all alone, and I carried him a kilogram of sugar and cheese in a net. When I realized I was in danger, I ran. The agents came after me. I felt that they were very close to me, so I decided to divert their attention by throwing the net with the food. What happened? Perhaps they, knowing that they were dealing with one of the leaders of the French frontiers, thought that the net contained a grenade. At any rate, I managed to gain a considerable distance at once. I went down the Rue Boyne de Perez, looked around, and, seeing nothing, entered the garden. I knocked at the door of the mansion. No one was there. There was a huge stack of straw in the garden, and I hid in it. Soon a car drove by, a dog barked. Then all was quiet. 2 hours later I emerged from my hiding place and headed towards Paris via Fontenay-sous-Bois and Vincennes. By arrangement with Cécile, I met her at Ivry, an hour late. Seeing me, she asked, "Has something happened to you?" After listening to my story, Cécile informed me that the police were checking the papers of all passengers on the bus line to Vincennes. Fortunately, I used the subway, so I was able to avoid an encounter with the police. In our practice, this was, as far as I can remember, the only case in which a communist managed to slip away from an encounter of which the police were aware. April was marked by a case involving Eugene Geneff's bodyguard. We learned of the arrest of the Chaplin family and the lumbermen at whom we had gathered so many times. Out of precaution, we had to leave the mansion at Perret. Cécile had long been acquainted with Marguerite de Maillard, and the latter told her of her friends who sympathized with us, offering asylum to our comrades. Thus, in 1942, we met the Guillemot couple who lived in Villeneuve-St. Georges. From that time on, we repeatedly took advantage of their hospitality in times of need, and in 1943 to 1944, this happened frequently. In Villeneuve-St. Georges, we were known by the surname Dubois. I was considered a clerk in the railroad department who had evacuated from Rennes. The house of the Guillemot couple was attached to another, inhabited by a creature of indeterminate age. Our hosts called this woman Mother Tenton. Every time we went out, Mother Tenton would open the curtain to look at us. "What a lovely couple," she'd say. Once at Montgeron, Cécile came to the station to meet a comrade and suddenly heard, "Madame Dubois, Madame Dubois." Cécile did not react at first, but when she realized it, she turned around. It was Mother Tenton calling her. After the liberation, we revealed to Mother Tenton who we were and what we had done during the occupation. She assured us that she had never suspected anything. However, her demeanor suggested that she had. Our hosts, the Guillemots, were very discreet and gracious. We enjoyed spending evenings with them and were warmed by the warmth of their family hearth. On the wall in their room hung a huge map of the USSR. After listening to the latest news, they would move the string marking the front line. In the first few weeks, I could hardly persuade my host to tune the receiver to the Moscow wave, but then I had to persuade him that my work required listening to London radio broadcasts. The landlord usually grumbled he preferred the reports about the heroic deeds of the Red Army at Stalingrad and Kursk. He had many underground apartments. There was, for example, an apartment in St. Geneviève de Bourgs, in which we once had the opportunity to spend the night. My friend Pansier, a merchant from Juigny, a veteran of the 3rd Artillery Regiment, gave me his documents, knowing the risks involved. Using these documents, I took an apartment. When we stayed overnight, we were always wary. This time I turned out the light and looked out the window at the half-empty street. There was no doubt a man was pacing back and forth in front of the house. This went on for 2 hours. After curfew ended, we packed our bags in our suitcase and returned to Villeneuve-St. Georges. How many times we moved around Paris and its neighborhoods with that yellow suitcase. Once, in 1942, I said to Cécile, "How heavy this suitcase is, even when it's empty. There's something wrong with it." With these words, I started measuring the suitcase inside and outside. It turned out that the difference was 5 or 6 centimeters. I had never seen a suitcase with a double bottom, but there was no doubt about it, there was something in the suitcase. With great difficulty, I managed to open the bottom, and I found several dozen anti-fascist leaflets in Italian. As Cécile told me, the suitcase had come to us from René Romagon, and she in turn had taken it from her father. During the heroic struggle against fascism in Italy in the 1920s, Father Repi carried leaflets and newspapers across the border to comrades fighting in Italy. From the bridge of Oti, we threw the leaflets into the scene, which had been stored for 14 years in a suitcase that had changed hands more than once. It would have been very foolish to be arrested in 1942 for having leaflets dated 1928.